It was always a lie, which
Yep.
a lot of us on the left, critics of American power and the liberal international order, have said for a long time, right? It's always been selective. It's always been one-sided. That's what lots of people in the global south have said for decades. And now the difference is you've got key sort of linchpins of that order coming out and saying it. It was always a sham. And we always knew it was a bit of a sham. And that, I think, is a real watershed. That is a historical moment where even the great supporters of the system say, not only is it dead, but it was always a bit of a crock.
Lie. Yep.
Milan ou Tripoli, Vilnius ou Benghazi, Paris, Moscou, on fait le boonga, boonga.
No one wants to go in there when a random fucking tweet can change the entire foreign policy of the country. It's one of my favorite quotes in the reporting from recent weeks. These are the conditions under an imperial administration that's broken partly loose from capitalist interests while not representing the democratic will either. It's pretty chaotic for everyone. Contrary to talk that the second Trump administration would represent a solid commitment to a populist and isolationist concept of America first, it actually suggests a hybrid approach, abandoning important aspects of globalism while also trying to assert US primacy across most of the globe, and in particular in what I like to call the West's B-side, that part of the world that pertains culturally to the West, but isn't part of the political West. I'm talking here about Latin America. So that's what we're going to be focusing on today. Today, for the record, being the 30th of January, in case something major happens between the time of recording and the time of release of this episode. This episode is on Trump's so-called hemispheric foreign policy, and in particular, its attacks on Venezuela, which spectacularly resulted in the abduction of President Nicolas Maduro on the 3rd of January, rather inconveniently for many of us who were still on our holidays and so on. Very inconsiderate. You know, he's many things, Trump. He's inconsiderate for sure. So this is the second in a two-parter. In the last episode that we released, you'll have heard us talk with Jean-François Drolet about the radical right, its theoretical bases, and how this plays out in foreign policy, especially Trump's foreign policy. And here now we're focusing on Latin America. This, if you haven't gathered by now, is BungaCast, the global politics podcast at the end of history. I'm Alex Hochuli in Sao Paulo, Brazil. I'm joined again by contributing editor Lee Jones in London. Hello, Lee.
Hello, hello.
And back on the podcast again is Juan Rojas. It's been a little while. Juan writes extensively covering Latin America for journals, including American Affairs and Compact. So, Juan, where are you calling us from? Is it anywhere near the capital of Latin American reaction?
Totally, yeah. I'm in Fort Lauderdale, kind of like Miami's junior.
Miami's B-side, Miami's own B-side,
Yeah.
maybe. Right. Very good. So both Lee and Juan have recent pieces in American Affairs discussing a lot of the issues that we're going to be talking about here. So to get started, I mean, that quote that I opened this episode from about the erratic nature of the Trump regime is actually from a private equity guy specialized in energy, which was quoted both in the Financial Times and in The Guardian. So, 2026 obviously kicked off with that remarkable abduction of Maduro, but also with Trump openly declaring that the U.S.'s intervention in Venezuela was about oil. He said, "We built Venezuela's oil industry with American talent, drive, and skill, and the socialist regime stole it from us during those previous administrations, and they stole it through force. This constituted one of the largest thefts of American property in the history of our country." So this is a war for oil, as left-wing critics have long alleged to be the motive force in U.S. foreign policy back to the Iraq war and onwards, it seems anyway. And here it's maybe provided with only the thinnest ideological justification. The U.S. isn't just going to steal the oil, it's going to steal back the oil, therefore lending it a thin layer of justice to the US's expansionist and imperialist claims and actions. So maybe just to get started, because a lot has happened obviously over the past nearly a month since then, but it might be worth nailing this down for starters. Was this a war for oil or not? As I think listeners will know, Exxon said soon after that they had no interest in Venezuela's oil, so it wouldn't be profitable. And then Trump then excluded Exxon from the Venezuelan oil bounty it had just rejected, like saying, "Well, I didn't want it anyway." Or here, well, you're not allowed it. You're not allowed it anyway. I said I didn't say it. I said I didn't want it. Well, then fine. Everyone's happy, except for a lot of people, a lot of upset people. Anyway, so who wants to deal with this first off?
Lee, you want to go ahead?
Oh, I was expecting you to come up with the magic answer as to why this happened. I mean, so the way that I see it is there are different factions within the Trump administration. As I say in the American Affairs piece, and as we discussed on the other episode, you've got the paleoconservatives, and you've also got traditional China warhawks and Pentagon types who would be more aligned with the people Juan writes about as neocons, who are quite keen on regime change
In
in
this
places
case,
like
the
Cuba.
Miami neocons specifically.
The Miami, particularly the Miami ones, Cuban descended, like to intervene, change regimes, and so on. So I think you've got that neocon regime changey type people around, but to me, they're a minority in this administration. I don't think Marco Rubio is at all powerful, despite the fact that he is Secretary of State and National Security Advisor. I think that's the position that Kissinger held, but by no means is he as powerful as Henry Kissinger was. So there's an influence there, but what does that look like in practice? They're not going to intervene, invade, boots on the ground, change the regime, and install a friendly regime, which is what Marco Rubio and his crowd seem to want. They can't do that because the paleos that we discussed in the other episode won't let them do it. So instead you get this bizarre decapitation operation instead, which leaves the regime intact, with somehow it's going to run it for America. So that's one thing. And the other thing is the oil thing is, I think, linked to this, the populist personalist nature of the regime. The fact that because there is no democratic formation of the national interest to be expressed through an America First foreign policy, it's left to the determination of this populist, erratic figurehead who can therefore enact quite fantastical visions of the American national interest. So fantasies of grabbing mineral resources in Greenland and oil resources in Venezuela, even though American capital is not remotely interested in doing these things, right? So they're only consulted after the fact and just expected to go along with Trump's bizarre vision, and they don't want to because it's not economically viable. So you've got the kind of factions that are operating, it seems to me, but you've also got the populist aspect of the regime resulting in weird and bizarre policy making. That's the way that I see it. But Juan, you're the expert on Venezuela, so you can tell me how wrong I am.
So I mostly agree with that. I guess the part I disagree with is I do think that Marco Rubio is very influential, actually. But I mean, yeah, what you're describing really gets at the heart of it, that there are these different factions with different interests. As far as specifically whether this is a war for oil, I think that Joe Weisenthal and Tracy Alloway at Bloomberg, I forgot who they were talking about, was saying that, or who they were talking to, but they were saying that in Trump's mind, this is about oil. Basically, going back to the personalistic nature that Lee described, if Venezuela didn't have all this oil, probably Trump wouldn't have signed off on it. So Rubio and the other Miami neocons, because the thing is, he staffed a lot of the State Department with allies from Miami, and basically all of the ambassadors to Latin America also are from Miami, his close friends. And yeah, they have a lot of influence and are going to be pushing in this direction. Similarly, within the national security state in general, the intelligence agencies, I can tell you firsthand that there are a lot of Latino descent neocons in extreme positions of power, and also the older generations bring a lot of that with them, that Cuba, Venezuela, Russia, blah 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 blah. But exactly, yeah, as Lee described, the problem is, you have the paleocons that basically would only agree to, like Trump, agree to go along with this as long as they get something out of it, which would be oil. And then the rest of the national security apparatus also sees this as just, well, at least we're kind of subordinating an ally of of Russia and
China.
China, Iran, blah blah blah. There's also because economically, I mean, there's some winners. The truth is that Chevron, for instance, stands to benefit handsomely from this intervention. Most likely, I mean, it's impossible to predict things. We don't know at the end of the day, but there is some low hanging fruit that certain oil majors might be able to benefit from slightly. As far as the broader oil sector, that's a bit more complicated. We can get into that. But the national, and this is the last thing I'll say, the national security apparatus does see it as beneficial that the U.S. basically now has oversight over this large pool of reserves in the Americas. They see that as being strategically important, even if they can't necessarily extract as much oil from there.
Yeah, I mean, Trump, for all that he's a very, hyper mediatic, postmodern sort of figure, he's also incredibly literal and many ways, as many people have pointed out, his head's in the 19th century, kind of claim resources, claim the oil quite literally through force, build a wall to stop the immigrants. Like there's no kind of more sophisticated policy to be done there. It's just build a literal wall that would stop people. So there's this literalism to it. But I think more importantly, with regard to the oil, is that, as we've already hinted at, there's the oil is in many cases not profitable to drill from the perspective of some of these U.S. oil majors. If it was, a deal would be possible, and so you don't necessarily need to abduct the president to get that done. And indeed, that was an argument that several critics of, or left-wing critics of the left made in the run-up to the Iraq war as well, that it wasn't necessary to invade Iraq to get access to its oil. And then finally, there's some further arguments, and I would point listeners, in fact, to an excellent thread, and I think an article also published in Jacobin by Matt Huber about why this is literally a war for oil. And then also maybe even just cite from a thread by Chris Morlock, pointing out that here's the reality. Nothing is extracted. What actually happened in Iraq was not oil extraction, but financial looting. The U.S. state shoveled pork barrel money into the military-industrial complex, especially firms like Halliburton, through no-bid logistics, security, and reconstruction contracts. Iraqi oil production, which hovered around 3.5 million barrels a day in the 1980s, collapsed to a few 100,000 barrels per day during parts of the 1990s and early 2000s. Even after the U.S. exit in 2011, it took another decade for Iraq to claw its way back to those production levels, and only then through Chinese state-led industrial investment, not American capital. So the simple kind of 19th century vision of just grab the resources is deeply misleading, because in many ways the oil is worth more in the ground to be speculated on than it is to be kind of directly controlled by your companies. So to move on from the oil, go on.
Can I just come in on the Iraq angle? Because reading your article, Juan, in preparation for this, made me think of another parallel to Iraq, which I wrote about in my book, Societies Under Siege. The way that I read the invasion of Iraq in 2003 was that because Iraq was getting sanctions relief, the regime was actually really fragile and unstable towards the end of the 1990s. But then sanctions relief came online, and things started to ease off and started to kind of solidify itself. And so what was happening was the breakdown of dual containment, the containment of Iran and Iraq. And I read the sort of easing of sanctions, the failure of sanctions to topple the regime, and then consequently the easing of it to address the humanitarian issues as a prompt for the war. The fact that it hadn't worked, requiring military force to get the job done. And reading your account of the situation in Venezuela is the massive economic crisis that follows the collapse in commodity prices and the increasing authoritarian nature of the regime. But then it stabilizes at round about 2021, if memory serves me correct. And it starts to sort of solidify itself and come back out again. And then it requires military intervention to finally decapitate the regime. Now, maybe I'm overanalyzing this, but it struck me as an interesting parallel. I wondered what you thought about that.
I'm not sure. I mean, I think that's an interesting point. And I mean, it makes it more absurd when you think about it, because like, you are putting into jeopardy if this condition of the country is stabilizing, and what you don't want to do, let's say in the, we can do, that's not the case for Iraq, but in Venezuela, if what they don't want to do, and Trump has said this, he had this incredible moment with a reporter outside the White House, that the reporter asked, "Why aren't you backing Machado? Why are you working with Rodriguez?" And he said, "Do you remember a place called Iraq? We went in there, everyone was fired. Everyone, every single one, the generals, the police, and they turned into ISIS instead of getting down to business." So, and reports have come out that the CIA has also said this. It's like, hey, look, like, yeah, if you go for full regime change, this whole thing, like, it could turn into this horrible, chaotic situations that will like repercut on us, the rest of the region. And it's good that they're thinking about that. I mean, I don't know if in the long run it'll make a difference, but to your point, I don't know. I mean, maybe. Well, I guess from the perspective of the Miami neocons, they see this as like, oh no, things are stabilizing. This thing will survive, and that is justifiably so. I mean, again, I live in South Florida. I talk to these kind of people all the time, and I understand where they're coming from. Frankly, they correctly, I think, view things in Venezuela as nothing could fundamentally change unless there is some sort of military strike from the U.S. And I mean, wow, like a lot of things can be said, but the Bolivarian regime, the Chavez Maduro Rodriguez regime, whatever we want to call it now, is one of the most resilient I have ever seen in any country ever. I mean, who else? Maduro had to be kidnapped. He survived hyperinflation, gang armed conflict with guerrillas, a failed coup attempt, a military uprising, mass protests over the course of 10 years. Way less, other regimes have like come down with way less. So that could be a part of it. I wanted to say also with what Alex, there was something Alex said that, with that, yeah, I mean, in the end, the irony was that the U.S. didn't actually manage to get that much oil from Iraq, and so
the Chinese got the contracts.
Exactly, and so that's what it was. That Alex said that the logical thing would just be to have cut a deal with Maduro or with Saddam for the oil. Yeah, long term, that would be best. It would involve the least amount of U.S. lives, resources expended on trying to increase oil production. But that's where we get into these different factions. In Venezuela's case, unfortunately, it clearly was Rubio in Trump's ear telling him, we can't trust this guy. We need him out tomorrow. Whatever he agrees to, we can't trust him. Reportedly, Maduro was willing to do everything that they asked, slash all the contracts with China, Russia, Iran, divert all the oil to the U.S., hand over, the critical minerals and whatever. He just wanted to serve out the remainder of his term, and that was unacceptable to the Miami lobby. They needed him gone tomorrow. And so what's Delcy doing? She's doing the same thing that her boss was, just that her boss now is, in New York.
So I want to get onto these internal divisions within the Venezuelan regime and indeed within Venezuelan civil society as well. There's a lot to talk about there, and your essay on this is very rich in bringing that to light. I just before that, because we're still talking about kind of justifications for the attack on Venezuela, how do you read the narco-terrorism thing? I mean, my instinct is just to dismiss it. It's a concocted thing in terms of Maduro's role in drug dealing or anything like that, let alone this portmanteau of narco-terrorism, which to me just reads like, well, we tried the war on terror and that didn't. We tried the war on drugs and then that didn't really work, and we tried the war on terror and that didn't really work. But what if we did them together? Maybe there's something more to be said there. So Juan.
Yeah, I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head. Part of that is, Rubio is really savvy because he managed to engineer this confluence around after like the summer of 2025. Before then, there was a lot of infighting between like the paleo conservative, like MAGA realists, primicists, and the Miami neocons. I mean, a few days into Trump's presidency, he said he sent Richard Grenell to shake hands for a photo op with Maduro, and they agreed, hey, yeah, look, we'll take the deportees, mass deportation, go ahead, we're cool with it, just let us keep Chevron's oil license. And that was what was agreed. But then what happened? oh no, the Miami neocons, and especially the 3 representatives in the House of Representatives, which they have a lot of influence because before the GOP only had like a 2-seat majority. Now they have a 1-seat majority, so they can sink anything that they want. And they threatened to sink Trump's so-called big beautiful bill unless they rescinded Chevron's oil license. And so Trump was like, okay, yeah, we'll do it. They rescinded the oil license. And then Venezuela cut off deportation flights, which led to what happening? The CCOT affair debacle, because they couldn't deport people to Venezuela. So they were like, hey, you know what? Let's just send 200 Venezuelans to this maximum security gang prison in El Salvador. And that, that we don't have to go into that. It was horrific because, like 90% of the deportees didn't have criminal records in any country in the Americas. Later on, they did this 3-way prisoner swap between El Salvador, U.S., and Venezuela. Venezuela let go some U.S. citizens it had in its custody. El Salvador sent the Venezuelan deportees to Caracas. And then the U.S. agreed to, again, restore Chevron's oil license, which has been active since then. Rubio, what he managed was, hey, look, you guys want to see bombs, boom boom. And the the reporting was they really wanted this in Mexico. And Rubio, thankfully, you can say a lot of things about him, but he's on record as not wanting to bomb Mexico. That's the thing about old school neocons. They realize that the closer the country is that you want to bomb, the more blowback you'll suffer. So that they prefer having some distance with that. But he realized, hey, you know what? What if I convince these guys? What if I give them what we want? What if we start blowing up narco-terrorists, Venezuelan narco-terrorists, and we use this to pressure the regime, pressure Maduro into stepping down? So it was really smart. And it's on the one hand, like the national security state, they like this kind of thing, that it's like, oh yeah, we're fighting terrorists and drug traffickers at the same time. And on the other hand, the narco-terrorist narrative has had a lot of pull within like Latino neoconservative communities for a long time. To be fair, it is credible that the Venezuelan regime has had dealings with drug traffickers. I mean, it's like it's like a quasi failed state. So obviously there's not that much control that they exercise, and a lot of the generals, all of that, they'll want to get a cut from this stuff. They'll compete. It's mostly toll booths. They'll like tax different individual traffickers to be able to operate in certain areas through certain routes. As far as like Maduro being directly involved as like a drug kingpin, that's a bit more difficult to prove, and that's why they dropped. When the day they brought him to New York, they dropped from the indictment, the description they had of the so-called cartel of the Suns, and that's because it's going to be a bit. They changed it to which they actually reinterpreted it to what it is more traditionally known as. It's not a formal drug trafficking organization. It's more a colloquial term that predates Chavismo, known to describe just corruption in the Venezuelan military, of which there is a lot of all different kinds. I described like one racket with someone I spoke to that was in the National Guard in Venezuela anyway. So
whatever else there's going on, it's not some sort of kingpin or controlled or centrally organized thing anyway.
It's like if we talk about the Miami Mafia, we're not actually talking about Marco Rubio being the head of an actual mafia, right? That's my understanding of the. Yes, I have read some things about. I have read some things. Yes, I have read that. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, his brother-in-law was convicted of drug trafficking, and if you've read anything about Miami history, the amount of Cuban Americans that have been involved in the drug trade in Miami, it's significant.
It's just the cartel of the sun. The cartel of the sun, as I understand it, was a kind of a kind of nasty label that people attached to like corruption within the security establishment in Venezuela in the 1990s. Exactly. Right? It wasn't an actual cartel.
Exactly. I mean, you can say the same thing about our own security apparatus, and I'm sure some of you guys have looked at the book that came out recently, the so-called Fort Bragg cartel, which frankly, I mean, is probably more of a case there that there was some kind of organized syndicate precisely, ironically, with Delta Force and all these guys, the opium trade in Afghanistan, which exploded while we were there.
Yeah, and the CIA's role in creating the opium trade and the heroin trade in Southeast Asia.
Totally. And then, yeah, not to mention the cocaine trade in the 80s with Iran-Contra and all of that. Noriega, who was a CIA asset, they knew he was trafficking. They just didn't care.
And the U.S.'s recent exculpation of the former Honduran president.
Oh, that one, it was horrific, because that one, the thing is, most of these cases against politicians being involved in the drug trade, they boil down just to witness testimony, which it's not completely, it's not to say it doesn't matter at all. But the problem is, think about this. If you're relying on the testimony, and almost always it's other drug traffickers. It's just drug traffickers saying, "Oh yeah, I gave $1 million to so and so. I did this favor. I gave a Lamborghini to President of what's his face, and he looked us up the other way." Could be true, but how do you prove it? And the thing is, these are self-interested actors. If they say that to the DEA, they'll get time off of their sentences. That's the way plea bargaining works, obviously. So you need more than just witness testimony. You need to be able to corroborate what they're saying. And in the case of Juan Orlando Hernandez, former president, two-term president of Honduras, this was an extremely solid case against him. They found like these ledgers with his initials on them for like cocaine shipments. They his like Google account had the contacts of like traffickers that then the DEA managed to geolocate visiting the presidential palace. I mean, this one is just a shut case. But because and we don't have to get into this, like Juan Orlando, he was like critical in like the creation of the smart city Prospera and Roatan in Honduras, and through like a lot of those interests, like Mark Andreessen and Peter Thiel presumably were in Trump's ear telling, hey, you need to pardon this guy, and we need the nationals the right to come back into power because they'll save our city. They've had legal troubles, etc.
Another one of these zones which we've spoken about, and we'll speak about more in the future. But let's turn to Venezuela properly. So the reading of this in general is that, at least in terms of the headline power struggles such as they are at the top of the state, you have one side represented by interim president Darcy Rodriguez, who Trump likes because he thinks he can work with her. She did a good job cleaning up or sorting out the petroleum industry, and therefore he can work with her. And on the other hand, you have the interior minister Diosdado Cabello, who comes, I think, is more closer to the military, seems pretty hardline defender of Chavismo. And so that's my read on it. What is actually the nature of the tensions between them, and how who do they represent beyond themselves?
So Diosdado, well, I guess I'll start with Delcy first. She's a very clever, cunning politician. She's had this meteoric rise. She started out as Maduro's like communications official, and then over the years managed to rise through the ranks all the way to vice president. Her brother as well. Her and her brother work as a team. Her brother now is the president of the National Assembly, the unicameral legislature. And as vice president, yeah, she oversaw this crackdown in the oil sector. There was this there was this like big crackdown in PDVSA, the state oil company, in 2023. They like took down Tarek El Aissami, which was this really important longtime general close to Chavismo, who was overseeing the company. And they found like gold bars in the executive suites, and the executives were like partying with prostitutes all the time. It's like people are starving. So anyway, apparently that endeared her to Trump and other people in the administration to some degree. Well, as I said before, what I'd say is like, who was your boss? Maduro. Like Maduro is the same. They're both pragmatic, operationally savvy individuals. The notable thing though is that she is. I mean, she's has a long history in left wing politics. Her like dad was a guerrilla and like whatever. But yeah, she is not seen as having the same clout as within the movement as like Diosdado. Diosdado was with Chavez during the 1992 coup. Cabello was in the military. And so a lot of like the paramilitary colectivos are purportedly very loyal to him. He has a lot of clout within the military. He's actually, for a long time, it's hard to say how true any of this is, but there were reports that he had this rivalry with Maduro, who like they'd see was also a civilian. Chavismo was considered to be a civico-military movement, which at this point really like the before and but especially now, the military is really all the ones that have the power. But so there's this suspicion from guys in the military that, you know, from the beginning were with Chavez against these civilians. Diosdado reportedly had this rivalry with Maduro, and Maduro, you know, because he was like Chavez's anointed successor, was able to retain clout. But Diosdado is seen as like more of a nationalist, not even as necessarily left wing. I mean, you know, they kind of can go together. But yeah, there was this report that he like led a column like days after Maduro's capture to the presidential palace. There was a worry, you know, he was trying to organize a coup. There was gunfire exchange. We're not really sure what happened. The official line from the regime was that, oh, there was some kind of drone that they didn't recognize, and so opened fire and didn't realize that they were then firing on like other um, security forces of the same regime. So who knows? But the administration has their eye on him. They see him as like the one that could like cause the most trouble. To then see after that incident, there were a lot of reports that came out that they put him on a list to target for a next potential strike. It's like, oh, don't try anything.
Right, right. I mean, one of the most evocative bits in your essay is that the scenes, the absurd kind of scenes being played out in Venezuela. So with the regime simultaneously maintaining anti-U.S. stances in some areas of policy, and even looking around cities looking for like pro-U.S. Operatives at the same time as they're actually cutting deals with the Great Satan. I mean, those are my words, not theirs or anyone else's. But you know, that there's these kind of contradictions going on, and I mean, I guess this is the chaos of the situation in Venezuela right now, and one which doesn't look like it's set to stabilize anytime soon.
Yeah, it's bizarre. I mean, you know, taking that Trump quote with that reporter we mentioned earlier, they've sort of learned that so-called nation building is a bad idea, but that's kind of what they're doing anyway. Just they're basically like they're trying to social engineer now this extremely authoritarian regime, which is really strange. And actually, to your point now, Nicolás Maduro Guerra, Maduro's son, said a few days ago now that the regime should consider restoring relations with Israel. So look at that. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, it should also be said that even after like an immediate regime change, things don't just automatically collapse. It takes time. So we will see. Something I've said is that maybe like a blessing in disguise. It's really the regime's secret weapon. The precarity of Venezuela's broader situation is in a lot of ways the regime's strength. Because I mean, you know, think about it. If the U.S. pushes too hard, forcing them to capitulate on like a lot of these like economic areas, the regime might want that, yeah, because what they wanted to get sanctions removed for a long time. But you know, some things might be just too unacceptable for them, especially as they try to like push them into like relinquishing power, presumably. That could lead to infighting, or if they start, you know, like just striking down, you know, further military action to kill specific leaders, that could cause the whole thing to collapse. And then, you know, you get a Libya-esque situation.
Yeah,
Rubio yesterday had this last thing, had this long hearing in Congress, 2 or 3 hours, really good. There's some good clips that came out of that. And he says that the official posture is to eventually have a democratic transition. So he has this 3-point plan. That one, it's stabilization, and then 2 is like restoring the like oil sector, and then 3, a democratic transition. Who knows? Maybe Trump won't go for that. That's clearly his interest. I mean, he did testify before Congress saying that now that their goal is not to have the regime in place in the long term. But there's a lot of different ways that this could go, and it's interesting.
I'm sure he'll be crying on his knees in the ashes of Venezuela, going, "But we had a plan. 3 points, 3 points in the plan."
The 3-point plan reminds me of the Chinese 4-point plan for peace in Ukraine, or any Chinese plan, which is not actually a plan. It's just a sequence of events one would ideally like to see.
Right, exactly.
Could you also speak to the various armed groups that are acting in Venezuela? The way that you describe it is the Venezuelan security forces are simply a primus inter pares. So you've not just got the factions within the regime, but you've also got various non-state armed actors. Can you tell listeners about those as well?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, because there's two ways principally that the regime is, like 10 years ago, like 2016, Venezuela was the most violent country in peacetime on the planet. Homicide rate was like 90, 100 per 100,000. It was insane. And interestingly, and this is kind of this kind of refutes, crime is a really complicated phenomenon that you can't really reduce to just one single issue. A lot of like left-wing thinkers like to say, oh, if you reduce poverty, that will cause crime to go down. Can happen. But for instance, under the entirety of Chavez's term, poverty went down a lot. But every year that he was in power, the homicide rate went up. But then, once Maduro took over and the crisis, then things got way, way worse. And so just to give like a little like radiography of like what things look like, you have the colectivos, they have a really interesting history, and not all of them actually are necessarily allied to Chavismo. They're like there were these motorcycle associations going back to like the 1980s. They're urban in Venezuelan cities. A lot of them had a kind of left-wing ideology, anti-establishment against all of the pre-Chavez governments. The like most important ones, like the Tupamaros and Caracas, are very ideological, very sympathetic to the regime, and they kind of like serve as like shock troops to be, like intimidate protesters or like themselves or organize protests. The regime has armed them. You'll see these images like guys on motorcycles with like these rifles and whatever. You have the ELN, the National Liberation Army. This Colombian guerrilla goes all the way back to the 1960s. At this point, it's interesting. You can actually describe it as a binational guerrilla, the first of its kind. When you think about insurgencies, especially left-wing insurgencies, it's true. You do find cases where they'll have like operatives in other countries, and they'll be very active in border zones, because border zones are really useful to evade, security forces from a particular country. And so, you can think about that with like the Central American guerrillas, Shining Path, blah, 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 blah. Same thing like the ELN, and like border zones, and the Colombian-Venezuelan border, the Ecuadorian-Colombian border is really useful for evading Colombian security forces. But what's interesting is that they actually control territory now. They've expanded very deep into Venezuela, all the way to the border with Guyana, actually. Supposed to be active in at least half or a majority of Venezuela's states. There's been eyewitness accounts of them working hand in hand with the Venezuelan military. On the other hand, sometimes they're directly in conflict with the military over illegal economies like illicit mining, stuff like that. And this is a really resilient, horizontal paramilitary organization that has just decades of experience, fighting insurgencies. They're divided into different blocks, each made out of fronts or columns, which can range from like 12 to 100 people. Extremely mobile. They can get across like extremely difficult terrain, stuff like that. Related to them are what are called, and Inside Crime calls them, the ex-FARC. The term for that is they're sometimes known as just FARC dissidents. The thing is, there's technically a difference between FARC fighters, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia. They demobilized in 2017 after the 2016 peace deal in Colombia. Some of their fighters, and this always happens, it's normal, choose not to join the peace process. And so those you could technically refer to as FARC dissidents. But then there are others that just kind of in the wake of the demobilization took up the name of the FARC, but weren't necessarily ever part of it before, et cetera, et cetera.
And these are like
And
by
these
this
are
stage just purely criminal operations,
for
or rackets. They're no longer
in large part, and you can say that it's complicated because both the ELN and the ex-FARC, and for instance, like the ex-FARC, I saw this a few days ago. Like there was fighting between like two ex-FARC fronts in Colombia, so there's like these big confederations for like the FARC dissidents, but it's very horizontal again, and so you can look at individual fronts. Some of them will be more or less involved in drug trafficking. Some of them will be more or less ideological. There's a lot of variation. Some fronts of the ELN actually they have a hard policy of not they don't like drug trafficking, and so they'll just resort exclusively to extortion, extorting businesses, etc., human trafficking, stuff like that. And last, what Lee referred to, really, we can say that the Venezuelan military is a kind of first among equals among all of these groups. So they're in conflict with them sometimes. They cut deals with them. And it's through this kind of symbiotic relationship that the regime over time has managed to really contain the violence from 10 years ago. So it does use repression. And at the height of like the 2010s, wow, I mean, the Venezuelan the security forces, especially that they call them OLPs, Operations of the Liberation of the People, in like poor neighborhoods in Caracas, they just would send the FIAS, the Special Action Forces, which were later disbanded, kill thousands of people, something like 5,000 just in 2018. And so it was just through this brutal repression, but also cutting deals on a case-by-case basis with these groups.
And the military
managed to stabilize the country in part.
And the military itself is, I mean, cut through by various different interests, local interests and fiefdoms already, right? I mean, there's maybe sections of it here in one place or another, one battalion which is involved perhaps in drug trafficking, but others. So I think the on the side of the state, it's not entirely like an integral.
It's not
block.
Monolithic. Yeah,
No.
You have this great line that there are 2,000 generals.
Yeah,
which is the largest of any army anywhere. So you'd have any invading force would have 2,000 people opposing you to defend their various rackets.
Yeah, exactly. It's a way of securing patronage. And Maduro was really good at this. Maduro seemed really dumb. A lot of the things he says, and his dancing and whatever. He was not a dumb guy operationally. He was well known as just like knowing the names of every single general, all of these like representatives, local power brokers and stuff like that. And so when you have this many generals, you can divide the spoils of like, different illicit economies and legal economies. Each one will have their racket and will want to defend it. So what I mentioned, I talked to this guy who was in the National Guard in Venezuela. He was making his way over to Colombia and through the Darien Gap. I was talking to him before he made the crossing. That's the border between Colombia and Panama. And he told me that like his general had this racket of like reselling concrete on the black market. So they would get, like subsidized concrete through the state and then resell it in like these poor communities, whatever, in Táchira. So, that's something you have to think about. And it's why like all of these generals, you need to give them incentives to cooperate with a democratic transition. Otherwise, that won't work. And this is where now we really get into the weeds of how on earth they're going to manage everything that they want. Rubio wants a democratic transition. Trump wants the oil. How do you get both? It's a real puzzle.
It seems like you just remember the Napoleon quote and just went, I'd rather not have lucky generals. I'd rather have many generals.
What do you think the prospects are? The pitch that you paint is a very fragile, networked arrangement, as it is in many countries. I mean, as you're speaking, I'm thinking of Myanmar, which is different because of the ethnic dimensions, but still this patchwork of different authorities, inadequate control by the state itself. factionalized and so on. And it's precisely these arrangements that military intervention can destroy or disrupt and then cannot rebuild, which is why state building so often fails. But what are the prospects, say, let's say the paleos win out and the United States does not intervene and still just tries to kind of puppet the Delcy regime. That's kind of scenario A. And then scenario B is, well, they can't get the cooperation they want. The neocons win out. Rubio gets his way. There's more military intervention of some kind, more bombings, whatever, that cause greater instability. What is the likelihood in those scenarios of civil war or even state collapse? Because you seem to think that there is some possibility of that happening.
Hello, friend. You've reached the end of the free part of the episode. Well, we put out 2 entirely free episodes a month. The rest is for subscribers. For access, please join us at patreon.com/bungacast. For $7 a month, subscribers receive episodes with the entirety of the BungaCast cast. That's George Hoare, myself, Alex Hochuli, and our contributing editors, Philip Cunliffe, Lee Jones, Amberly Frost, Catherine Liu, Alex Gurevich, Ryan Zikraf, and Lee Phillips, as well as a huge number of guests. In 2026, our priorities are to explore the following themes: emerging state capitalism, war and militarism, political recombinations and new revolts, irrationalism and unfreedom and how to challenge these ideas, and the pre-political, or the social bases on which politics may be built. We'll also be exploring these themes through the BungaCast Reading Club, through a selection of classic essays, book chapters, films, and academic articles. If you sense history accelerating but feel that we have no control over events, then join us as we try to find political clarity to move beyond the decadent age of Bunga Bunga.